She was swapping targets on the range, and when a SEAL suddenly handed her his rifle. The morning sun beat down on the outdoor shooting range as Sarah adjusted her safety glasses and loaded another magazine into her rifle. The familiar weight of the weapon in her hands brought comfort after another sleepless night. 3 months had passed since she'd returned from Afghanistan, but the nightmares still came every time she closed her eyes. Sarah had been a military police officer, stationed at a forward operating base where mortar attacks were as regular as meals. She'd seen things that changed her forever, lost friends who should have made it home. Now, back in civilian life in San Diego, the shooting range had become her therapy. The controlled environment, the precise movements, the focus required to hit targets. It all helped quiet the chaos in her mind. She raised her rifle and took aim at the paper target 50 yards away. Breathe in, breathe out, squeeze the trigger gently. The shot rang out and she watched through her scope as the bullet struck just outside the bullseye. Close but not perfect. Nothing ever felt perfect anymore. "Nice grouping," came a voice from the lane beside her. Sarah glanced over to see a tall man with short-cropped hair setting up his own shooting station. He had that unmistakable military bearing, straight posture, economical movements, eyes that constantly scanned the environment. She nodded politely but didn't engage. The range was her sanctuary, and she preferred to keep to herself. The stranger seemed to understand her need for space. He focused on his own shooting, and Sarah couldn't help but notice his precision. Every shot found its mark dead center, even at distances that challenged her own skills. This wasn't just weekend warrior shooting. This was professional-level accuracy. Sarah finished her first set of targets and walked downrange during the ceasefire to examine her results. Her groupings were tight, but they consistently pulled slightly to the right. She'd been fighting this issue for weeks, adjusting her stance and grip, but something wasn't quite right. When she returned to the firing line, she found the man from the next lane examining her target setup with professional interest. "Sorry," he said, raising his hands apologetically. "Old habit. I noticed you were having some consistency issues." "I can handle it myself," Sarah replied, more defensively than she intended. "I'm sure you can." "Army?" "Military police." "You?" "Navy Special Operations." He extended his hand. "Mike Rodriguez." Sarah hesitated before shaking it. "Sarah Chen." "Listen, I don't mean to intrude, but I noticed you're pulling slightly right. Mind if I watch your form on the next round? Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes helps." Part of Sarah wanted to tell him to mind his own business. She'd been shooting since she was 12 years old, competing in high school and college before joining the military. She knew what she was doing. But another part of her, the part that missed the camaraderie of military life, was curious about this stranger's obvious expertise. "1 round," she said. "Then I'd like to get back to my own practice." Mike nodded and positioned himself slightly behind her, careful not to invade her personal space. Sarah loaded a fresh magazine and took her shooting stance. She could feel his eyes analyzing her form as she raised the rifle. "Your fundamentals are solid," he said quietly, "but you're anticipating the recoil just a fraction of a second before you fire. It's pushing your shots right." Sarah lowered the rifle. She'd heard this criticism before from instructors, but she thought she'd corrected it. "I don't think I'm flinching." "It's not a flinch exactly. More like a micro-adjustment. Your body knows the recoil is coming and tries to compensate. Very common with experienced shooters who've been in combat zones." The way he said it made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience with post-deployment adjustment issues. "What unit were you with?" she asked. "SEAL Team 7. Did 4 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq." Mike's expression remained neutral, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that mirrored her own experiences. "How long have you been back?" 2 years. You? 3 months? Mike nodded knowingly. The range helps, doesn't it? When the world gets too loud. Sarah felt a knot in her chest loosen slightly. Someone who understood. It's the only place where things make sense anymore. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 veterans finding common ground in their shared struggles. Other shooters continued their practice around them, but the conversation felt private despite the public setting. "Would you like me to show you an adjustment that might help with that rightward pull?" Mike asked. "No pressure. Just one soldier helping another." Sarah considered his offer. She'd been stuck on this issue for weeks, and her pride had prevented her from asking for help at the range's pro shop. Maybe accepting assistance from someone who clearly understood both shooting and the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life wouldn't be such a bad thing. "Okay," she said, "but just this once." Mike moved closer, maintaining appropriate distance while positioning himself to observe her stance. "The key is to embrace the recoil instead of fighting it. Your body is trying to control something that can't be controlled, which creates tension right before the shot." He demonstrated with his own rifle, showing her how to adjust her grip and breathing pattern. "Think of it like accepting the inevitable rather than trying to prevent it." Sarah tried to implement his suggestion, focusing on relaxing into the shot rather than bracing against it. When she fired, the bullet struck closer to center than any of her previous attempts. "Better," Mike said. "Now try 5 rounds in succession," focusing on that same mindset. As Sarah prepared for her next series, she realized this was the first normal conversation she'd had with another person in weeks. Not the careful, walking on eggshells talks with family members who didn't understand what she'd been through, or the clinical discussions with VA counselors. Just 2 people who understood the weight of service talking about something they both found meaningful. She fired her 5 rounds, and when they walked down range together to examine the target, both were impressed with the improvement. The grouping was tighter and more centered than anything she'd achieved in recent weeks. "That's solid shooting," Mike said with genuine admiration. "You've got natural talent." "Thanks for the help," Sarah replied, and meant it. "I've been struggling with that for longer than I care to admit." As they walked back to the firing line, Sarah found herself hoping that Mike would be back at the range soon. It had been a long time since she'd met someone who understood both the technical aspects of shooting and the deeper reasons why they needed to be here. 3 days later, Sarah found herself looking forward to her range session in a way she hadn't experienced since returning home. She arrived at her usual time, mid-morning, when the range was less crowded, and scanned the lanes hoping to see Mike's familiar figure. When she didn't spot him immediately, she felt a surprising pang of disappointment. She set up at her preferred lane and began her routine, implementing the breathing and grip adjustments Mike had shown her. Her shots were noticeably improved, clustering much closer to center. The progress felt good, but she missed having someone to share it with. Halfway through her session, she heard footsteps behind her during a ceasefire. "How's the new technique working out?" Sarah turned to find Mike approaching with his equipment bag, a slight smile on his face. She felt her mood lift immediately. "See for yourself," she said, gesturing toward her target. Mike whistled appreciatively. "That's impressive improvement in just 3 days. You're a fast learner." They settled into adjacent lanes, and Sarah found herself relaxing in a way that had become foreign to her. Mike's presence was calming. He understood the importance of both focused silence and the occasional technical discussion. During a break between shooting rounds, Mike asked, "What did you do before the military?" "College. Criminal justice major. I was planning to be a police officer, but after my deployment..." Sarah trailed off, unsure how to explain that the thought of dealing with domestic violence calls and traffic stops felt impossibly trivial after what she'd experienced overseas. "The adjustment is harder than people think," Mike said quietly, "especially when your civilian plans don't fit who you've become." "Exactly. My family keeps asking when I'm going to get a real job and move on with my life. They don't understand that I don't know what moving on looks like." Mike nodded. "I got out 2 years ago and still haven't figured it out completely. I'm doing some private security work, but it doesn't feel like a career, more like treading water." Sarah appreciated his honesty. Most veterans she'd encountered either claimed to have everything figured out or were so deep in their struggles they couldn't discuss them rationally. Mike seemed to exist in a middle ground she found comforting. "What made you join the SEALs?" she asked. "Honestly, I was angry about 9/11 and wanted to do something meaningful. I was 22 and thought I could help fix the world." He paused to adjust his rifle scope. "Took me a few years to realize the world doesn't want to be fixed, at least not the way I thought it did." "Do you regret it?" "The service? Never. The brotherhood, the purpose, the skills, all of that made me who I am. But transitioning back, that's been the hardest thing I've ever done. And I've done some difficult things." They resumed shooting, but the conversation continued during breaks. Sarah learned that Mike had grown up in Texas, joined the Navy straight out of high school, and spent 8 years in special operations before getting out. He'd been married briefly, but his ex-wife couldn't handle his deployment schedule and the changes in him after each return. She wasn't wrong, Mike admitted. I came back different every time. More distant, more suspicious of everything. She deserved better than someone who jumped at loud noises and couldn't sleep through the night. Sarah understood completely. Her own relationships had suffered similarly, though she'd never married. I broke up with my college boyfriend right after I got back. He kept trying to plan these elaborate dates and social gatherings, and all I wanted was to be left alone. He thought I was depressed. Were you? Probably. But it was more complicated than that. I wasn't sad exactly, I was displaced. Like I belonged somewhere else but couldn't get back there. Mike finished his magazine and set down his rifle. You know what helped me the most? Finding purpose again. Not the same purpose we had in the military, but something that used our skills and experience. Such as, I started volunteering with a program that teaches firearm safety to women who've experienced domestic violence. Sounds simple, but it gave me a way to use my training to help people who really needed it. Sarah found this intriguing. She'd never considered that her military skills might translate into meaningful civilian volunteer work. How did you find that program? Through the VA, actually. They have a volunteer coordinator who matches veterans with organizations that need our specific skill sets. Before Sarah could respond, the range safety officer called for another ceasefire. As they walked down range together to examine their targets, Mike continued, The thing is, these women come to the classes terrified and leave feeling empowered. It reminds me why I learned to shoot in the first place, to protect people who can't protect themselves. Sarah studied her target, noting the consistent improvement in her groupings. I never thought about teaching others. I've always seen shooting as a solitary activity. It can be, but there's something powerful about sharing skills that can literally save lives, especially with people who've been made to feel helpless. As they walked back to the firing line, Sarah found herself genuinely curious about this volunteer work. The idea of using her military training to help other women appealed to her in a way that traditional civilian careers hadn't. Would you mind if I asked you more about this program sometime? Of course. Actually, there's a demonstration class this Saturday morning. You're welcome to observe if you're interested. Sarah hesitated. She'd been avoiding commitments and social obligations since returning home, preferring the flexibility of having no schedule or responsibilities. But something about this opportunity felt different. Where is it held? Same range, actually. They rent the facility Saturday mornings for the classes, 8 to 10 a.m. I'll think about it, Sarah said, though she was already pretty sure she'd be there. They finished their shooting session with Mike offering a few more technical suggestions that further improved Sarah's accuracy. As they packed up their equipment, Sarah realized this had been the most normal and constructive conversation she'd had in months. Thanks again for the help, she said. I haven't felt this good about my shooting in a long time. Thank you for letting me help. It felt good to teach again. As Sarah drove home, she found herself thinking about the volunteer program Mike had described. The idea of helping other women develop confidence and self-defense skills resonated with her in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time since her discharge, she felt a spark of genuine interest in something beyond her own recovery. Maybe this was what moving forward looked like. Not abandoning her military identity, but finding new ways to use the strength and skills she'd developed in service to others. Saturday morning came faster than Sarah expected. She'd spent the previous 2 days debating whether to show up at the demonstration class, alternating between excitement and anxiety about the commitment. Finally, she decided that simply observing couldn't hurt, and if she felt overwhelmed, she could always leave. She arrived at the range 15 minutes early and was surprised to find Mike already there, setting up equipment with 2 other people, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a younger man who also carried himself with military bearing. Sarah, Mike called out when he spotted her. I'm glad you came. He introduced her to Linda Rodriguez, the program coordinator, and Sarah learned with amusement, Mike's older sister. The resemblance was obvious now that she knew to look for it. The other volunteer was James Martinez, a former Army Ranger who'd joined the program 6 months earlier. Mike mentioned you have military police experience, Linda said warmly. We can always use instructors with formal law enforcement training. I'm just observing today, Sarah said quickly, not wanting to commit to anything yet. Of course. But feel free to jump in if you see ways to help. The first students began arriving shortly after 8 o'clock. Sarah was struck by how diverse the group was. Ages ranged from college age to senior citizens, and their backgrounds seemed equally varied. Some appeared confident and curious, while others seemed nervous or even frightened. Linda began with a welcome circle where each participant introduced herself and briefly explained why she'd come to the class. The stories were powerful and sometimes heartbreaking. A young mother whose ex-husband had violated a restraining order, a college student who'd been attacked walking to her car, an elderly widow whose neighborhood had become increasingly dangerous, a business owner who worked late hours alone. What struck Sarah most was how these women supported each other during the introductions, offering encouragement and understanding without judgment. It reminded her of the best aspects of military camaraderie. Mike started the technical instruction with basic firearm safety, covering the fundamental rules with patience and clarity. Sarah found herself impressed by his teaching style. He was thorough without being condescending, serious about safety, while maintaining an encouraging tone. When the group moved to hands-on instruction with unloaded weapons, Sarah noticed one participant struggling with the basic grip and stance. The woman, Maria, appeared to be in her 40s and had mentioned during introductions that she'd never held a gun before, but wanted to learn after a break-in at her home. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward. "Would you like me to show you a slight adjustment that might help?" Maria nodded gratefully, and Sarah guided her through a more stable grip and foot position. The key is to think of the gun as an extension of your body, not a separate tool you're fighting against. "That makes so much more sense," Maria said, her confidence visibly improving. Linda appeared beside them. "Sarah, you're a natural teacher." "Maria, how does that feel now?" "Much better. More controlled." Sarah found herself moving between participants during the dry fire practice, offering small adjustments and encouragement. Her military training had included instructor development, but she'd never realized how much she enjoyed the teaching aspect. When they moved to live fire with .22 caliber rifles, Sarah was officially brought into the instruction rotation. She worked with 3 students who were struggling with accuracy, helping them with breathing techniques and trigger control. "Remember, the rifle will do its job if you let it," she told one student who was trying too hard to control the recoil. "Your job is to provide a stable platform and let the shot happen naturally." By the end of the 2-hour session, every participant had successfully hit the target multiple times. The transformation in their confidence was remarkable. The same women who'd arrived nervous and uncertain were now talking excitedly about their progress and asking about the next class. During cleanup, Linda approached Sarah. "I have to ask, would you consider joining our instructor team? You have exactly the combination of skills and personality we need." Sarah hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of commitment." "What would ready look like?" Mike asked, joining their conversation. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I guess I worry about being responsible for other people when I'm still figuring out my own life." "Look," James said, setting down a box of equipment. "I felt the same way when I started. Thought I was too messed up to help anyone else. But helping others actually helped me figure out my own stuff." "The program is very flexible," Linda added. "We hold classes twice a month and instructors can participate as their schedule allows. No pressure to commit to every session." Sarah looked around at the equipment being packed away, thinking about the women who'd left the range that morning, feeling stronger and more capable than when they'd arrived. The experience had been energizing in a way she hadn't felt since her discharge. "What kind of training would I need?" "You already have the shooting expertise and military background," Linda explained. "We'd want you to complete a 40-hour instructor certification program that covers teaching techniques, trauma-informed instruction, and crisis de-escalation. The next cohort starts in 3 weeks. Trauma-informed instruction?" Mike nodded. "Many of our students have experienced violence or threats. We learn how to teach firearm skills while being sensitive to trauma responses and creating a safe learning environment." This aspect particularly appealed to Sarah. Her own experience with post-deployment stress gave her insight into how trauma could affect learning and performance. "Can I think about it?" "Absolutely." "But Sarah?" Linda paused in her packing. "You have a gift for this. I watched you with our students today, and you have exactly the right combination of expertise and empathy." As Sarah drove home, she reflected on the morning's experience. For the first time since her discharge, She'd felt useful and engaged in a way that connected to her military identity without requiring her to return to active duty. The students' stories had resonated with her own experiences of feeling vulnerable and needing to regain a sense of personal security. Her military training had given her skills that could literally help these women protect themselves and their families. By the time she reached her apartment, Sarah had made her decision. She would sign up for the instructor training program. It felt like the first positive step forward she'd taken since coming home. That evening, she called the number Linda had given her and left a voicemail expressing her interest in the certification program. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to something beyond her next range session. The program offered her something she hadn't realized she was missing, a way to serve others while continuing to develop her own skills, and a community of people who understood both the importance of self-defense and the challenges of overcoming trauma. As she fell asleep that night, Sarah's dreams were free of the usual nightmares. Instead, she dreamed of confident women hitting their targets and walking away stronger than they'd arrived. The instructor certification program proved more challenging and rewarding than Sarah had anticipated. Over 3 intensive weekends, she learned about adult education principles, crisis management, and how to create inclusive learning environments. But the most valuable lessons came from understanding trauma responses and how they affected learning. During one session, the training coordinator, Dr. Rebecca Hayes, asked the instructor candidates to share their own experiences with learning under stress. Sarah found herself opening up about her struggles with concentration and hypervigilance since returning from deployment. Those same stress responses affect our students, Dr. Hayes explained. Many have experienced domestic violence, assault, or other traumas. Understanding how stress impacts learning helps us create better educational experiences. Sarah began to see connections between her own post-deployment challenges and what their students might be experiencing. The hypervigilance that made her constantly scan for threats could help her recognize when students were becoming overwhelmed or triggered. Mike was also in the certification program, and they often debriefed together after training sessions. "I never realized how much my own experiences could be an asset in teaching," Sarah told him during a break. "I always saw my deployment stress as a weakness." "That's the thing about helping others," Mike replied. "It shows you that your struggles have purpose. Every difficult experience becomes something you can use to understand and help someone else." The certification program also included supervised teaching opportunities. Sarah's first practice session was with a group of women from a local domestic violence shelter. She was nervous about working with students whose trauma might be more recent and severe than her own. Her assigned student was Jennifer, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s who flinched every time someone moved quickly or spoke loudly. Sarah recognized the hypervigilance in Jennifer's eyes, the constant scanning for threats, the difficulty concentrating on instructions. "This is your first time shooting?" Sarah asked gently. Jennifer nodded. "I never thought I'd need to know how to protect myself. I was married to someone I thought would always keep me safe." Sarah understood the complicated feelings behind that statement. Learning to protect yourself doesn't mean you failed at being protected. It means you're taking control of your own security. She worked with Jennifer slowly, explaining each step thoroughly and allowing plenty of time for questions. When Jennifer's hand shook while loading the magazine, Sarah shared her own experience with post-deployment anxiety. "My hands used to shake too, especially in new situations. It's your body's way of staying alert to danger. We'll work with that instead of fighting it." By the end of the session, Jennifer had successfully fired multiple rounds and hit the target consistently. More importantly, she was smiling for the first time since arriving at the range. "I can't believe I did that," Jennifer said as they packed up the equipment. "I feel different, stronger." "You are stronger," Sarah confirmed. "You always were. Now you just have new skills to go with that strength." After Jennifer left, the supervising instructor, Linda, approached Sarah. "That was beautiful work. You have an intuitive understanding of how to reach students who are dealing with trauma." Sarah felt a warmth of accomplishment she hadn't experienced since her military commendations. Teaching felt natural and meaningful in a way her previous career plans never had. The final weekend of certification included role-playing exercises for handling difficult situations. Students might panic during live fire, become triggered by loud noises, or break down emotionally during class. Sarah learned de-escalation techniques and crisis intervention strategies. During one exercise, she had to respond to a simulated student panic attack. Drawing on her military first aid training and her new understanding of trauma responses, Sarah was able to calm the student and safely manage the situation. "Excellent work," Dr. Hayes commented. "You maintained safety while showing empathy and helping the student feel supported rather than embarrassed." On graduation day, Sarah received her certification along with 11 other new instructors. Linda announced that the program had received funding to expand from 2 classes per month to 4, and they needed experienced instructors to help train the additional volunteers. "Sarah," Linda said after the ceremony, "would you be interested in becoming a lead instructor? It would involve mentoring new volunteers and helping develop curriculum." Sarah was surprised by the offer. "I've only been teaching for 3 weeks. But you have military training experience, natural teaching ability, and personal understanding of trauma recovery. That's exactly what we need in a leadership role." Mike encouraged her to accept. "You're already helping other instructors during practice sessions. Making it official just recognizes what you're already doing." Sarah accepted the position, realizing that for the first time since her discharge, she was excited about a career opportunity. The role would involve teaching classes, training new instructors, and working with community organizations to expand the program. Her first assignment as lead instructor was training a group of college-age volunteers from a local university. These students brought enthusiasm and energy, but lacked life experience with the serious situations that brought women to the firearms safety program. Sarah developed a training module about empathy and appropriate responses to students' personal stories. "You'll hear difficult things," she told the volunteers. "Stories of violence, fear, and survival. Your job isn't to counsel or fix these women. It's to teach them skills while creating a safe, supportive environment." One volunteer, Ashley, asked, "How do we respond when someone tells us about being attacked or abused?" Sarah drew on her own experience receiving support from Mike and Linda. Listen without judgment. Acknowledge their courage in sharing, and focus on how learning these skills represents them taking positive action. Don't try to solve their problems, but help them build confidence and competence. The training session went well, and Sarah realized she was developing her own teaching style that combined military precision with trauma-informed compassion. She was creating the kind of supportive learning environment she wished she'd had during her own difficult transition. After the session, Ashley approached her. "Can I ask you something personal? You seem to understand trauma really well. Is that from your military experience?" Sarah considered how much to share. "I've had my own challenges with adjustment and healing. I've learned that our difficult experiences can become strengths when we use them to help others. That's inspiring. I hope I can develop that kind of wisdom." "You will, if you stay open to learning from the people you're trying to help." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She'd gone from isolated and directionless to engaged in meaningful work that used her military skills and personal experience to help others. The nightmares still came occasionally, and she still had difficult days. But now she had purpose beyond her own recovery. She was part of something larger than herself again, and it felt like coming home in a way that civilian life hadn't before. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer, the domestic violence survivor she'd worked with during certification. "Starting my own firearms safety class next week. Thank you for believing in me." Sarah smiled as she pulled into her driveway. This was what moving forward looked like. Not leaving her military identity behind, but finding new ways to serve and protect others while continuing to heal and grow herself. 6 months into her role as lead instructor, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet. The program had received a special request from the city's police department to train a group of female officers who'd been involved in traumatic incidents and were struggling with confidence issues on the shooting range. "These aren't typical students," Linda explained during their planning meeting. "They're experienced with firearms, but they're dealing with performance anxiety related to their traumatic experiences. Some witnessed officer shootings, others were involved in violent arrests that went wrong." Sarah understood the complexity of the situation immediately. These women had professional reputations and careers at stake. Unlike civilian students who came to classes voluntarily seeking empowerment, these officers were being required to regain shooting proficiency or face job consequences. Mike would be assisting with the class. Along with James and 2 other experienced instructors, the department specifically requested you as lead instructor, he told Sarah. They heard about your military police background and wanted someone who understood both the tactical requirements and the psychological challenges. The night before the class, Sarah couldn't sleep. She'd worked with trauma survivors for months now, but never with people whose professional competence was being questioned. These women were facing not just personal fears, but potential career-ending performance issues. She arrived at the range early to set up, choosing to use her own rifle for demonstration purposes. It was the same weapon she'd struggled with when she first met Mike. Now it felt like an extension of herself, reliable and precise. The 5 female officers arrived together, their body language revealing varying levels of anxiety and defensiveness. Sarah recognized the posture of people who were used to being competent and were struggling with feeling vulnerable. Good morning. I'm Sarah Chen, and I'll be your lead instructor today. She kept her tone professional but warm. I know this situation is different from our usual classes. You're here not by choice, but because the department wants to ensure your safety and effectiveness on duty. One officer, Detective Lisa Warren, spoke up. With respect, we all know how to shoot. We're having temporary performance issues, not training deficits. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. That's exactly why we're going to approach this differently than basic firearms training. We're going to talk about how traumatic experiences can affect fine motor skills and concentration, even in people with excellent training. She could see some tension leave the group's shoulders. By acknowledging their competence rather than treating them like beginners, she'd established credibility. Sarah began with a brief discussion of trauma physiology. When we experience or witness violence, our nervous systems can develop protective responses. These responses are adaptive. They help keep us safe, but they can interfere with precise motor skills like shooting. Officer Maria Santos raised her hand. I've been shooting since I was 12. I qualified expert every year until last month. Now I can't hit the broadside of a barn, and nobody can tell me why. Tell me about what happened last month. Maria hesitated, then described responding to a domestic violence call where the suspect had fired at her partner. No one was injured, but Maria had been forced to return fire for the first time in her career. Since then, every time I'm at the range, I keep replaying that night. I can't focus on my front sight because I keep seeing his face. Sarah nodded. That's called intrusive imagery, and it's a normal trauma response. Your brain is trying to process a life-threatening experience, but it's interfering with your ability to focus on current tasks. She demonstrated a breathing technique she'd learned in her own therapy. We're going to practice anchoring your attention to physical sensations, the feel of the rifle, your breath, your stance, so your mind has somewhere to go when the intrusive images start. The group practiced dry fire drills while implementing the anchoring techniques. Sarah moved between the officers, offering individual adjustments while maintaining their dignity and professionalism. Officer Janet Kim was struggling with shaking hands. I've never been nervous about shooting before, she said, clearly frustrated. I don't understand what's wrong with me. Nothing's wrong with you, Sarah assured her. You witnessed your partner get shot 3 weeks ago. Your nervous system is in protective mode. We're going to work with that instead of fighting it. She taught Janet a technique for managing adrenaline responses, using controlled breathing and progressive muscle relaxation. The goal isn't to eliminate the stress response. That's not possible or healthy. The goal is to perform effectively despite it. When they moved to live fire, Sarah used her own rifle to demonstrate each drill first. Her shots were consistently accurate, but she made sure to narrate her thought process. I'm noticing my heart rate is slightly elevated because we have an audience. I'm acknowledging that feeling and returning my attention to my breathing and sight picture. The officers began to show improvement as they implemented the techniques. More importantly, they were beginning to understand that their struggles were normal responses to abnormal experiences, not professional failures. During a break, Detective Warren approached Sarah privately. Can I ask how you know so much about this? You seem to understand exactly what we're going through. Sarah considered how much to share. I'm a combat veteran. I went through my own period of struggling with skills I'd previously mastered. What I learned is that acknowledging the impact of trauma isn't weakness. It's the first step toward regaining competence. How long did it take you to get back to normal? I'm not sure normal is the right word. I learned to be effective while carrying my experiences rather than trying to pretend they didn't happen. The afternoon session focused on scenario-based shooting, simulating high-stress situations the officers might encounter on duty. Sarah designed drills that gradually increased stress while allowing the officers to practice their new coping techniques. By the end of the day, all 5 officers had met department qualification standards. More importantly, they understood that their recent struggles didn't reflect professional incompetence but normal responses to traumatic experiences. As they packed up equipment, Officer Santos thanked Sarah. "You gave us our confidence back without making us feel broken or defective. That means everything." After the officers left, Mike helped Sarah clean up the range. That was masterful teaching. "You managed to address their trauma while maintaining their professional dignity." I remembered what it felt like to doubt myself after deployment. These women needed to understand that their struggles were normal, not career-ending deficiencies. Linda joined them as they finished packing. "The police captain called an hour ago. He wants to contract with us for ongoing training programs. Apparently word is spreading about your approach to trauma-informed tactical training." Sarah felt a mix of pride and responsibility. "I think there's a real need for this kind of specialized instruction. Most training programs either ignore trauma responses or treat them like weaknesses to overcome. Would you be interested in developing a formal curriculum for law enforcement agencies?" Linda asked. "We could expand the program to serve officers, military veterans, and other professionals who need to maintain shooting proficiency while dealing with trauma." The opportunity was exactly what Sarah hadn't known she was looking for, and a way to combine her military experience, her personal journey through trauma recovery, and her newfound passion for teaching. "I'd love to try," she said, "but I'd want to bring in mental health professionals to ensure we're providing comprehensive support." "Of course. We're thinking about applying for federal grants to fund a pilot program." As they walked to their cars, Mike shared his own news. "I've been offered a position with a private security firm that specializes in training law enforcement. They want me to head up their trauma-informed tactics division." Sarah was happy for her friend but surprised by her own reaction. She felt sad at the thought of losing their partnership. Over the months, Mike had become not just a colleague but a trusted friend who understood both her professional goals and personal struggles. "That's a great opportunity," she said, meaning it despite her mixed feelings. "It is. But I turned it down." Sarah stopped walking. "Why?" "Because what we're building here matters more than a bigger paycheck. This program is changing lives. The students' lives and our own. I don't want to leave something meaningful for something that's just profitable." They stood in the parking lot for a moment, both understanding the significance of Mike's decision. He was choosing purpose over prestige, community over individual advancement. "Besides," Mike added with a grin, "someone needs to keep you from taking on more projects than you can handle." Sarah laughed, realizing he was probably right. In her enthusiasm for helping others, she sometimes committed to more than she could reasonably accomplish. "So what's next for the program?" she asked. "Linda wants us to present our training model at the National Law Enforcement Training Conference next month. If the pilot program gets funded, we could be training instructors across the country." The scope of what they were building began to hit Sarah. What had started as a chance encounter at a shooting range had evolved into a potential national model for trauma-informed firearms training. That evening, Sarah called her parents for the first time in several weeks. The conversations had been difficult since her return from deployment. They worried about her isolation and struggled to understand her challenges. "You sound different," her mother observed after Sarah described her work with the program. "Different how?" "Happier. More like yourself again." Sarah realized her mother was right. The person she'd become through this work felt more authentic than she had since before her deployment. She was still carrying her experiences from Afghanistan, but now they served a purpose beyond her own survival. "I think I found what I'm supposed to be doing with my life," she told her parents. "It uses everything I learned in the military, but in a way that helps people heal instead of preparing for war." Her father, a Vietnam veteran who'd struggled with his own adjustment issues, understood immediately. "That's what we all hope for, honey. To find a way to use what we learned in service to make things better." As Sarah hung up the phone, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day at the range when she'd just been trying to quiet the chaos in her mind. She'd found not just healing for herself, but a way to help others find their own strength. The range had become more than therapy. It had become the foundation for a new kind of service. And Mike's decision to stay meant they would continue building something meaningful together, transforming their own experiences with trauma into tools for helping others reclaim their confidence and competence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since before her deployment: genuine excitement about the future. 1 year after their first meeting, Sarah stood at the same shooting lane where Mike had initially offered to help with her accuracy problems. But today, instead of working on her own struggles, she was preparing for the most important presentation of her life. The National Law Enforcement Training Conference had accepted their proposal to demonstrate trauma-informed firearms training. Representatives from police departments, military training units, and veteran services organizations from across the country would be watching their methods and evaluating their effectiveness. Nervous? Mike asked, setting up equipment in the adjacent lane. Terrified, Sarah admitted. What if we can't replicate the success we've had locally? What if this only works because we know our students personally? Then we learn something valuable and adjust our approach. But I don't think that's going to happen. Their demonstration would include live training with volunteer participants who had trauma histories, followed by a presentation of their outcome data. Over the past year, their program had worked with over 200 students, and the results were remarkable. 93% of participants completed the full course, and 87% reported increased confidence in their ability to protect themselves. More significantly, follow-up surveys showed that students were applying the trauma management techniques they'd learned to other areas of their lives. Many reported improvements in sleep, concentration, and overall anxiety levels. The first participants in today's demonstration began arriving. Sarah was pleased to see several familiar faces, including Jennifer, the domestic violence survivor she'd worked with during her certification training, and Officer Santos, one of the police officers from their recent class. "I can't believe you asked me to be part of this," Jennifer said as she checked in. "A year ago, I was afraid to leave my house. Now I'm helping demonstrate a national training program." "You earned your place here," Sarah replied. "Your progress represents what's possible when people are given the right support and tools." The audience began filing into the observation area, serious-faced professionals with notebooks and skeptical expressions. Sarah recognized the look. These were people who'd seen countless training programs promising revolutionary results, and they were prepared to be unimpressed. Linda introduced the program with an overview of their philosophy and methodology. Traditional firearms training often treats trauma responses as obstacles to overcome. Our approach treats them as normal reactions to abnormal experiences that require accommodation and understanding. Sarah took over for the technical demonstration, working with a group of 6 volunteers that included veterans, survivors of violent crime, and law enforcement officers. She began with the same breathing and centering techniques she'd learned to manage her own stress responses. "We're going to acknowledge that everyone brings their personal history to this training," she told the group. "That's not a weakness or a problem to solve. It's information we can use to customize your learning experience." She demonstrated the anchoring techniques, showing how students could maintain focus despite intrusive thoughts or physical stress responses. As the volunteers practiced, she narrated her observations for the audience. "Notice that Maria's breathing became shallow when we introduced time pressure. Instead of pushing through that response, we're going to work with it by adjusting the drill timing to match her natural rhythm." Mike joined the demonstration, showing how instructors could recognize and respond to various trauma responses without calling attention to individual students' struggles. Their teamwork was seamless. They'd developed an intuitive understanding of how to support each other and their students. During the live fire portion, the volunteers showed steady improvement not just in accuracy, but in confidence and emotional regulation. Jennifer, who had started with trembling hands, was now coaching another participant through a difficult moment. "This is what recovery looks like," Sarah told the audience. "Not the absence of trauma responses, but the development of skills to manage them effectively." After the practical demonstration, they presented their outcome data and fielded questions. The audience's skepticism had clearly shifted to genuine interest. A training director from the FBI Academy raised her hand. "How do you scale this approach?" Your success seems to depend on highly skilled instructors with personal experience with trauma. Sarah had anticipated this question. You're right that instructor selection is crucial, but we've developed a certification program that can train qualified candidates. The key requirements are shooting expertise, teaching ability, and either personal experience with trauma or extensive training in trauma-informed care. A veteran services coordinator from Texas asked, "What kind of follow-up support do students need after completing the program?" Mike answered this one. "We've found that ongoing practice opportunities are essential. Many of our graduates become volunteer assistants in subsequent classes, which reinforces their own skills while helping others." The most challenging question came from a police captain. This approach sounds time-intensive and expensive compared to standard qualification courses. How do you justify the cost? Sarah chose her words carefully. The traditional approach to officers struggling with trauma-related performance issues is often remedial training or fitness for duty evaluations that can end careers. Our approach has helped officers return to full duty status while addressing the underlying trauma responses. The cost of losing trained officers to preventable performance issues far exceeds our program expenses. After the formal presentation, several attendees approached them individually. The FBI training director wanted to discuss implementing a pilot program at Quantico. A veterans organization from Colorado was interested in licensing their curriculum. The Texas coordinator asked about training instructors for rural areas. Most meaningful to Sarah was a conversation with Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher studying veteran suicide prevention. "What you've demonstrated today represents a paradigm shift in how we think about trauma and competence," she said. "You're showing that acknowledging trauma responses isn't admission of weakness. It's the foundation for developing real resilience." That evening, the conference organizers announced that Sarah and Mike's program had won the Innovation in Training Award. As they accepted the recognition, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a struggling veteran trying to improve her shooting accuracy and a former SEAL willing to share his expertise. Neither of them could have imagined that their chance meeting would evolve into a nationally recognized training program. "I have something for you," Mike said after the ceremony, pulling a small wrapped package from his pocket. Inside was a brass nameplate reading, "Sarah Chen, Program Director." Below her name was an engraved image of a rifle crossed with an olive branch. "The olive branch represents peace, but it also represents growth and healing," Mike explained. "That's what you've brought to this work, the understanding that strength and healing can coexist." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. The nameplate represented more than professional recognition. It symbolized her transformation from an isolated veteran struggling with her own recovery to someone who could help others find their own path to strength and healing. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter from Jennifer, who had been accepted to a police academy and wanted to specialize in working with survivors of violent crime. The letter ended with a sentence that perfectly captured the impact of their work. "You taught me that my experiences didn't make me broken. They made me prepared to help others who were going through similar struggles." As Sarah read the letter in her office at the expanded training center, she realized that this was exactly what recovery looked like. Not the erasure of difficult experiences, but their transformation into sources of strength and service to others. The rifle that had once represented only her personal struggle for accuracy had become a tool for teaching others that precision, confidence, and healing were all achievable, even after trauma. The range where she'd first met Mike remained her place of personal practice, but it had also become something larger. A place where people discovered that their scars could become sources of strength, and that service to others was often the most powerful path to personal healing.